Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. Actually, it's the most common form of dementia in those who are over the age of 65. And dementia simply is a term that means you have a loss of cognitive function, of memory and thinking skills. It deteriorates over time.
Welcome to Graceful Aging. I'm your host, Gregory Bader. Today we have somewhat of a report card on the nation's status and our place and our knowledge of Alzheimer's disease. Something that is growing with the population that's growing and something that our nation has to confront and deal with. And we have two of our nation's leading experts in this field. We have Dr. Howard Fillit, who is from the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, and we have George Vradenburg, who is the Executive Director of US Against Alzheimer's. Gentlemen, thanks for being with Graceful Aging today.
Thank you for having us.
So do we have a cure? Is it going to happen next week? Where are we, doctor, on the status of a cure for Alzheimer's?
Well, we've been doing research for about 35, 40 years now since Alzheimer's was discovered as the most common cause of dementia or senility in the elderly. And we've made really rapid and amazing progress just in my own career lifetime. And right now we have about 100 clinical trials going on of new drugs for Alzheimer's disease, some of them in late stages. We'll hear about some of them towards the end of this year, I think, to see if they're actually going to work. I think a cure is a long way off, but I think effective treatments that are reasonably safe is probably going to happen within the next 5 years. So I think we're getting closer, but we're going to have to keep working at it for a long time.
Now, people have read a lot, and we get a lot of snippet information, and it's such a devastating disease that people do want to be armed with, are they going to get Alzheimer's themselves? Mm-hmm. What are some basic risk factors, and can you do anything to prevent Alzheimer's?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what I like to say is basically everything that we know about to prevent heart disease probably also protects your brain. So, for example, exercise is really important for your brain, not just your heart. And it's not just blood flow. There are factors that are released during exercise that actually protect your brain from damage. Smoking is bad for your brain. Heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, if you have them, you should really manage them very well because they're bad for your brain. Things like obesity are actually turning out to be bad for your brain. And eating a good diet, making sure you don't get deficient in certain vitamins, B12 and vitamin D in particular. Basically avoiding head injury. So in summary, there's a lot of things you can do to protect your brain that we think would delay the onset of Alzheimer's, which is primarily associated with aging, with an average age of onset of about 76 or 78. So at that age, about 35–40% of people will get it. And so the idea is to push back the time that people get it through these preventative measures.
George, I would imagine that every year that we can push back the onset of Alzheimer's would save our country a few bucks, wouldn't it?
Well, right now it costs the country about $200 billion simply to care for those people who do have the disease, and that number is going up every year. 70% of that is to Medicare and Medicaid. So it's $200 billion by the end of 2011, excuse me, end of 2012, that's this year. And if you look cumulatively over the next 10 years, it'll be $2 trillion. If you look to 2050, it'll be $1 trillion a year.
These are incomprehensible numbers, aren't they?
Well, look, we are now, baby boomers are turning 65 at the rate of 10,000 a day. And risk is the single greatest risk factor. Age is the single greatest risk factor for this disease. So the people that are entering into the age of risk now at a very rapid rate, and that's why those numbers are growing so rapidly. Women are 2 times as likely to have it as men. African Americans 2 times as likely as whites. Hispanics 1.5 times as likely as non-Hispanic whites. So this is not only a disease that has huge numbers, 5 million now, rising to 16 million, even as 20 million are dying. But also it has a disparate impact on women and minorities.
I mean, it is, you can see how it impacts then not only those individuals, but then count the number of individuals that are in their family units and neighborhoods that affects as well.
Our polling, when we ask people, do you have it in your family, 1 out of 3 people say they have it in their family. Now that's the financial impact, since this disease, you typically is 7 to 8 years after diagnosis that people actually have to be cared for. That's an emotional toll on the family as well, particularly the family caregiver with the primary assignment to do that. 60% of the caregivers are women. There are kids now caring for their grandparents. So the burden of emotional burden, financial burden, physical burden, since caregivers tend to have higher rates of depression and themselves have higher rates of doctor's visits and hospitalizations because of the physical burden of taking care of someone who is totally dependent upon their care. So the impact on families is extraordinary.
You know, I do think that some families or individuals who say, okay, well, my dad doesn't have it, my mom doesn't have it, it's not impacting my household. But even if this disease doesn't impact your immediate household, your pocketbook and your tax dollars are being used to care for this growing disease, isn't it?
You just imagine that $1 trillion a year to take care of the victims of Alzheimer's and support their families is going to be greater than the defense budget by that period of time. And you just think to yourself, you know, we're either going to have defense or we're going to have care for Alzheimer's. That's an intolerable and unacceptable choice. And so my organization is committed to try to accelerate the research, get more mobilized resource around the research here and abroad. Since from a patient's point of view, do I care whether this is a French solution or a Chinese solution? I care that there is a treatment, successful treatment, safe and effective for Alzheimer's. So I'm willing to go to the world.
One of the things we're trying to do is try to prevent this disease progressing because it's an aging disease. And aging is the #1 risk factor. We've actually shot ourselves in the leg. What I mean that we have better health, we live longer, so we get aging diseases. And 400 years ago, 500 years ago, probably nobody suffered from Parkinson's because they died at the age of 30, 40. And as I said, there is a significant financial burden, and of course, in many ways, this disease is even worse than cancer because it's a living death. Not only, of course, what happens to the patient, but the burden it has on the family and the environment. I mean, it's a devastating disease.
I think a lot of people believe that it's a genetic, you pass it on in terms of if my father had it or grandfather had it. Is it all about genes with Alzheimer's? Or?
I don't think so, for a couple of reasons. One is we know that actually there is a rare genetic forms of this disease that occur usually in people under the age of 60, but it's probably only about 1% of all the cases, and it's very uncommon. So the majority of people get the disease around 76, 78 years old, and in those people, we haven't really found any genes that cause the disease. One gene that's related to what we think is cholesterol metabolism, actually, is called apolipoprotein E. They call it ApoE for short. That gene, if you have a certain form of that gene, which is called ApoE4, and if you have if you get one of those E4s from your mother and one from your father, so you have both of them as being E4, your risk of Alzheimer's disease is about 15 times the regular population. So there is a genetic risk factor. What's important to know about the genetic risk factor, though, is not so much whether or not you have it, but the things that our foundation is doing to try to understand why ApoE is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, because ultimately if we can just understand why it's a risk factor, then we can develop drugs to address it and also learn more about how to develop drugs for Alzheimer's disease. So that's something that our foundation is actively doing. We're trying to understand the nature of the biology of what's going wrong when people have the E4 so that we can help other scientists around the world to develop drugs to correct that and ultimately better understand and develop drugs for Alzheimer's disease more broadly for everyone.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that, so that if I understand that correctly, as far as the studies that are underway, there are genetic studies, like you say, why do these genes have certain impact? And I guess that is part of, finding an indicator. Am I going to get Alzheimer's? Do we know, is there a test where I can determine whether I'm going to get Alzheimer's?
Well, there's no genetic test unless you have these rare mutations, which are very rare. But what we do have now coming to market, I hope, from the FDA, it's in front of the FDA right now, and may be approved by the FDA in the next few months, let's say, is a brain imaging test where a person is injected with a very micro dose of a molecule that goes into the brain and attaches to the amyloid plaques that we think are very involved in the disease and certainly characterize the disease. So it's a diagnostic test. And you go in, you get this molecule, and then about an hour later you get a brain scan, a PET brain scan. It's completely benign, very safe. And if you have the amyloid, then your brain lights up on the scan. So it's going to be used to help diagnose people, especially in the early stages where it's very hard for clinicians to make a diagnosis because of the difficulties in doing the cognitive tests that are necessary to see how, if a person's thinking properly on abstract reasoning and memory and this sort of thing. But what it's really taught us, because there's already been a lot of research with this test, is that people start developing the disease 20, maybe even 30 years before they actually lose their minds at age 76. So now we can identify people before they become demented.
Well, let's talk about that. So that's part of the research that's necessary. If you can find the population 20 years before some of the more serious manifestations that you've talked about, George, then that will aid in the research.
Right.
But simply knowing that I might have Alzheimer's 20 years sooner, is there any drug that can arrest it or stop it? What's the status of that?
There's no drug. It's gonna take a while before we actually get the drugs. I believe we'll get the drugs, in the next 5 or 10 years. We can talk about drugs. It's really hard. It costs $1.5 billion. It takes 12 to 15 years. This is not an easy problem. If this were as easy as putting a man on the moon, we would have done it, because we've already put a man on the moon. This is much harder than putting a man on the moon.
Well, let's take a break, then we'll come back, and I've got so many more questions. So take a look at these sites, and we'll be back in just one moment.
Questions. When you're caring for a loved one with Alzheimer's, not a day goes by that you don't have them. Questions about treatment options, home nursing, finances, about whether you're doing the right things, where to go for extra help, how to live better with the disease. So many questions. Where do you start? Alzheimers.gov. The answers start here.
We're back with Dr. Howard Fillit and George Vradenburg, two of our nation's leading experts on where we are with Alzheimer's.
By mobilizing the research community with government, with business, and most importantly, with people. As I said before, the disparate impact on women and blacks and Hispanics is huge, and the impact on families, as you pointed out, is enormous. So how do we turn that pain and that injury to the family into mobilized, engaged, and enraged citizenry that says we have to get at this disease? So I think that's the challenge for me. Howard's got the challenge of making sure that we apply those resources intelligently and get a means of prevention and treatment. But we have complementary roles, and we work pretty closely together. Me to try and mobilize the resources for him, and for him to try and stimulate a means of prevention and treatment.
Well, and compliments are in order to both of you, and to you specifically, George. We have a new national law that's been put in place. I, in my own mind, remember it by it's the auto parts law, but it's not an auto parts law. NAPA, and what does that stand for?
The National Alzheimer's Project Act.
And
it basically requires the administration to come up with a national plan on Alzheimer's, which it did last May, and it had a major research conference at the NIH in May. And that is the first step to getting a national research plan, priorities, where are the gaps, where should we apply additional resource. And it's the first step to potentially identifying a global research plan, so that when France and England and other countries invest their resource into research, that in fact it is complementary, coordinated, and collaborative.
Well, I think that's fabulous, because you've got so many different players. That's a good step.
It is a good step. David Cameron, the Prime Minister of England, announced last March that in fact he was doubling up the research into Alzheimer's disease in England. France has a national plan. They actually have allocated more money than they can find productive outlets for in France, and are asking and looking around on how to coordinate and collaborate with other nations and their research communities. So China is going to have more Alzheimer's victims alone in that country than all the developed nations put together by 2040. So all of these nations who are confronting the problem of increased aging populations with increased incidence of Alzheimer's, which are such a big drain on everyone's public health systems or on family systems in countries that don't have a public health system. Every country is motivated to try and get at this disease.
You know, and so the national plan that's been put in place that you were instrumental in getting those votes for, that does start to coordinate the international system as well?
One of its requirements is that the United States increase its level of coordination and collaboration with other nations around the world. A national plan for the United States, but also increased coordination and collaboration globally.
Now, I want our viewers to get an understanding. I mean, we're talking about massive dollars in terms of the cost to our nation and as you say, to the world. And when people hear in newspapers that we're spending 50 million or 100 million, it's hard for them to comprehend what those numbers mean and how much is needed at the research end to seek cures or treatments that are possible. What amount of money are we spending, say, now, and is that money enough? And why don't you put it in comparison for our viewers of how much we spend on the other illnesses? And I'll show the chart for them. But
good. Well, right now we're spending about $450 million a year in research on Alzheimer's through our National Institutes of Health, primarily the National Institute of Aging. We spend about $3 billion a year on HIV/AIDS research and now looking for a vaccine. We spend about $4 to $5 billion a year for heart disease and about $6 billion a year for cancer.
now, you're not urging some class warfare among the different illnesses.
No,
What's
I
the
would
point?
simply point out that the investments that we've made in HIV/AIDS, in heart disease, and in cancer have actually, the deaths per year from those diseases have gone down over the last decade. The deaths from Alzheimer's, where we have not invested adequate funds, has gone up 60%. So there is a consequence to underinvestment in one area and making productive investments in another area. It works. So there is a real potential here as we begin to look at what kind of resource we need. And the inventory that was done earlier this year has at least a first draft of what that budget is, and it's about $2 billion a year. And if you spend that over 10 years at $20 billion or longer, you're likely to get a very significant impact in reducing the costs of care in ways that would pay back that investment by a factor of 10 or more.
Fabulous. So we have to think broader than a current budget deficit, and we've got to think of long term of how these dollars are being used. How much does a research project take, and how long, take any aspect of the Alzheimer's disease. How many people and how much money does it take to try to really produce something?
Well, let me try to put it in perspective. As I mentioned before, it takes about $1.2 billion to $1.5 billion to develop a drug. It takes about 12 to 15 years. The risks are enormous. And one phase 3 clinical trial, which is the step before an FDA approval, which occurs in the latter part of those 12 to 15 years, costs $300 to $400 million. And you need 2 of those studies to put the drug before the FDA. So we're talking about $800 million. Now, in the earlier stages, where drugs are just in the very early stages of being discovered, the costs of that kind of research are much, much less. We fund studies at the level of $300,000, $1 million, that kind of thing. And there are just so many opportunities for new drugs for Alzheimer's disease. I mean, I've seen 3,000. In the last 12 years, I've seen about 3,000 ideas from people all over the world for new drugs for Alzheimer's disease, and our foundation has funded about 370 of those programs. So we've funded 370 new drugs, and some of those have gone into the clinic and are being tested in patients today. But it takes an enormous effort, a lot of scientists. You need teams of scientists. It has to be collaborations between industry and academia and government and foundations. And it's just a very, very difficult field, but we have made a lot of progress. So for example, there's other ways to do this as well. There are drugs on the market like hypertension drugs and diabetes drugs that could be used for Alzheimer's disease. This is called repurposing.
Well, I want to talk about that because I've read about that, and I know when families are struck by this illness, they're in a crisis mode and seeking out any solution. But before we talk about that, it's going to escape me. Is that an early sign of some impending problem? No. the as far as, oh, I lost my train of thought.
Yeah.
Is a loss of train of thought an early sign of Alzheimer's?
That was
you know-
very clever of you.
Well, but the challenge really is getting, I would say primarily physicians, primary care physicians, to understand how to do that, okay? Because I'm a geriatrician, and I know, in principle, what happens with what we call, actually, we don't call it aging, we call it adult development. We believe that human development goes throughout the lifespan, which is a different perspective on everything. It gets us away from something we could talk about called ageism, which I think has a profound effect on how we view Alzheimer's disease.
I thought of what I wanted to ask. I know that there's a whole body of drugs now that you see in all the magazines, and I could go through the list of them, that when people are placed in facilities, they receive these, and it's to either retard or slow down. Do we have an effective drug modality to arrest it, to stop Alzheimer's in its tracks?
Well, right now, there's basically 4 drugs on the market that are symptomatic agents. They improve memory and function a little bit, but we don't have any drugs on the market that actually slow down the disease. There are supplements out there, and if you go into the stores, you'll see a lot of memory factor drugs. And the vast majority of these have never been proven to work. People take a lot of them. The only one that I think has any real value and has gone through a clinical trial among the supplements is DHA, which is basically a form of fish oil. And there is a lot of evidence that actually fish oil is very good for your brain. The way I describe it is that our brains have a speed of processing, just like your computers, and they need to be, the wires in the brain basically need to be insulated, and a lot of the insulation in the wires in your brain are made up of omega-3 fatty acids, particularly one type called DHA. And
I
so-
had salmon last night. I feel good.
Well, and there was recently a study looking at, blood levels of these omega-3 fatty acids and cognitive function, and there was a direct correlation. If you had more blood omega-3 fatty acids, your cognitive function was better. So that's another thing that people can do. I think that's reasonable and relates to how diet, and it also tells us something about, again, always getting back to the same place. How can we develop drugs? How can we take all this knowledge from epidemiology and what's been out there about fish and smoking and all this exercise, and use that information to understand how to create new drugs.
Now, with this impending problem that's going to be developing and this huge cost that you talk about, we do have to look beyond, say, a pharmaceutical approach to it, a pharmacological approach to it, and have to look at lifestyles. Is that part of the national plan as well, to get our country looking at their own health in a different way to avoid the onset of Alzheimer's?
Yes, it is. I mean, the national plan is not just focused on research and drug discovery, but also improvements in the quality, the dementia-educated quality of our clinical workforce and our nursing and home health aid workforce, as well as what we can do in terms of long-term support and support for family caregivers. So all of those issues are on the plate in the national plan and will be addressed in the national plan. Behavioral interventions, what kinds of things can you do to defer the onset, slow the onset or defer the onset of symptoms? What kinds of things can you do with caregivers to enable them to set their expectations of what is going to happen and how themselves to relate to the potential depression that they will have, that their entire life is now sucked in by this? What kind of tools can we give to people to enable them to get out into the community, go to the movies as a neighbor comes in and sits with a dementia patient? All of those things are within the national plan, and all of them are important, because this is not a situation where they're either you're going to cure the disease or you're going to care for these people. It is a continuum. There are people at risk, there are people with early elements of the disease and early stages, and there are people with late stages, and we have to take account of that entire continuum of people, because the numbers are large, the impact is great, and getting family expectations right, getting the support right, is an important part of the plan.
So now I've got to ask you, as far as your own comfort level and optimism of, Dr. Fillit, you say in 5 years you're pretty confident that we're going to get a cure or a treatment? Okay, and George, are you comfortable that this national plan is set up, that we're going to have some dramatic changes that our nation will be seeing along these lines?
This is an enormous challenge because there are so many contending issues that command resources from our federal government that unless we actually engage private industry in a way that will maintain, if not increase, their investments in this space, unless we actually engage with foreign governments and their capacity to fund research, I don't think our federal government can do it. I don't think it is its capacity right now and for the foreseeable future, given the other priorities and the politics of this town. I think it's a major challenge to think that this is going to be mobilized just by the federal government. But I recently spent some time in Texas. Texas recently passed a $3 billion bond issue to fund cancer research in Texas. There are other avenues to fund research in this country than just out of the federal budget and just out of the NIH. And I think we have to explore all of those because I do think this is going to be a major challenge to mobilize resources at a time when our federal government is under fiscal stress. And so we need leadership from the federal government, but we're going to look to a lot of different places to try and find the resources and the reforms we need to get to a result. Am I confident? I'm optimistic. I wouldn't be in this game if I thought that this was a hopeless task. I think the scientists are making significant breakthroughs even at the level of funding that they're sustaining today, but we haven't got that much time. This is a matter of urgency. This is a matter where we ought to be getting angry at the powers that be, whomever they are, to say we need a solution faster. More resource, more focus, more speed.
And is it somebody else's problem? Speak to our viewers who are out there that are concerned and smart, and they're at their kitchen tables and they say, well, you guys are just two smart guys and you'll take care of it. How can average people complement the work that both of you are doing?
I've been a geriatrician over 30 years, so I've been taking care of people with Alzheimer's for well over 30 years. And, you know, I like to say I've never met a family with Alzheimer's disease or a patient and their family with Alzheimer's disease that I can't help. And so there are things that doctors can do today to help people manage this illness. It is a manageable illness. And, you know, I think that if a family is out there that, you know, is suffering, that they need a diagnosis, somebody is acting strange, has memory problems, change in personality, they need to find a doctor in the community who really has experience and is a specialist in Alzheimer's disease, because things can be done. And it's not always the primary care doctor, although I do believe that primary care doctors can take care of people and families with Alzheimer's disease.
Well, I thank both of you for your work and for the continued work. And on behalf of all of our viewers, we say keep at it, keep going strong, and get the news out there, because our viewers want to help as well solve this huge national urgency that we have. George Vradenburg from US Against Alzheimer's and Dr. Howard Fillit from the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, thanks for being with Graceful Aging.
Thank you for getting the word out.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for being with us today. Stay tuned, stay informed, be a part of this growing community that's going to stop this vicious disease that is crippling the world as well as our nation. We'll see you next time on Graceful Aging.